This video will describe and demonstrate the processes involved in replacing the ignition distributor cap and rotor on a single overhead camshaft Porsche 944 engine. In addition to the 30,000 mile replacement interval for these components, symptoms of a failing distributor cap or rotor would include a no-start condition or difficulty starting, engine misfires or running rough, hesitation or stalling, and unusual engine noises, sputtering, tapping, or clicking sounds around the area of the distributor cap. The cap and rotor also need to be removed to perform other engine work such as replacing the drive belts or the camshaft assembly seals, etc. The distributor cap and rotor are wearable items on the 944, and the plug wires can also dry out and develop cracks. Periodic inspection of these items should be part of regular maintenance on the car. Because of the high voltage repetitively arcing between the rotor and the terminals inside the distributor cap, these areas naturally break down over time. If you observe any signs of pitting in the metal contacts on the rotor or the distributor, that's an indication that they should be replaced. To begin replacing these items, you'll first want to disconnect the spark plug cables and set them aside. These will simply pull straight off of each connection point. If you're replacing your plug wires, they can be routed in and out below the fuel rail and in between the high pressure fuel line without removing the rail. It just requires a bit of maneuvering them at various angles to work them out. With the plug wires out of the way, the distributor cap can be removed. It's held in place by two spring-loaded hook screws. The screws will need to be fully depressed into the cap housing and then turned in a clockwise direction to be released. This is really the only challenging part of the job, as getting the right leverage to turn the screws while holding them depressed can be a little bit tricky. If you choose to use a flathead screwdriver, a shorter one will be needed to access the lower screw. Personally, I've had greater success using a small ratchet with a flathead socket attachment, as it allows for better leverage. Most technical articles will tell you to rotate the top screw 90 degrees clockwise and the lower screw 270 degrees clockwise. The 270 degree turn, however, is difficult to track and nearly impossible to perform with a single hand movement, and because the hooks can't really be seen inside, you can't judge their overall position. I've found it easier to simply turn both screws 90 degrees clockwise and then slightly twist the cap to the right as it's pulled off. Once the distributor cap is removed, the ignition rotor comes next. It's secured by a single 3mm hex head bolt, and these little bolts generally have some Loctite applied to them, so go ahead and make sure your tool is fully and evenly applied to avoid stripping the bolt head. With the bolt out, give the rotor a twist and pull it straight off the end of the connector on the end of the camshaft here. Oftentimes this dust cover will also be missing on these cars, and while the engine can run without it, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace it so that any debris from the drive belt system doesn't end up fouling up the ignition contacts inside the cap. And at this point, you can now perform any other needed work on the car or begin reinstalling the new ignition components. Before I begin installing the new parts, I thought it would be a good idea to take a quick look at some of the ignition system components. The ignition system consists of a distributor cap, a dust cover, a rotor, the ignition coil, spark plug cables, and spark plugs. The ignition coil takes a 12-volt current and steps up or transforms that current to the thousands of volts needed to fire the spark plugs, and that is sent down the center terminal on the distributor cap and then to the rotor. That arm spins around in synchronization with the camshaft, a sequence of 1, 3, 4, 2. So it spins and triggers each of those connections, and 1, 3, 4, 2 translates as 1, 3, 4, and 2 on the distributor cap. So the current is sent down to the sweeping arm, where it's transferred through small gaps to each of the 4 plug terminals. And there's wear that occurs there over time, and the recommended replacement interval is every 30,000 miles. If they're going bad or have gone bad, you'll experience performance issues like misfires or no-start conditions. So it's a good idea to inspect and replace these periodically. The spark plug cables connect to each of the leads and then to the spark plugs mounted into the cylinder head, and that way the current is sent to the appropriate plug to ignite the air-fuel mixture in the cylinders for proper ignition timing. To install these parts, we'll start with the dust cap. The factory workshop manual says to install the dust cover with some quick-drying cement, which is essentially super glue. It feels a little strange to be super gluing parts to the car, but that's what it calls for. So just do a little bit around the edge before installing it. Otherwise, it'll just kind of float around in there and not be too secure. Next up is the ignition rotor. I'll be replacing this rotor because some of the plastic material chipped off during operation, and that just goes on mounted with the set screw. Followed by the distributor cap. We can see that the cap has the spring-loaded hooks to mount to the front of the cam gear cover. And if we position these hooks with the top one pointing to the left and the lower one pointing to the right, you can essentially just do a 90-degree turn counterclockwise to catch the adjoining hooks inside the cam gear cover. And if the hooks aren't catching initially, it's probably because they're not pushed in far enough. They need to be almost completely bottomed out in the housing to appropriately connect with the other hooks inside. And finally, with the distributor cap in place, we can reconnect the ignition coil cable along with all the spark plug cables and confirm that the routing is correct for each cylinder number. Now that all the ignition components are installed, you can go ahead and start the car and inspect for normal operation.